Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories pertaining to polls and how they may be more messed up than you ever would have thought before, or at least getting a little bit of a peek behind the curtain about how they're actually done and why they might be a little bit skewed this election cycle. And then also a story about how a poll is actually being used to push a very particular point of view and why we always have to take polls with a grain of salt. And of course, we will end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive and ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So how often do you look at a poll and say, 100% accurate, I agree? Is it just the polls that you're biased towards, or do you have a skepticism towards all polls? Especially after 2016, I've had a deep skepticism towards all polls because it showed one person winning by a lot and the other person ended up winning pretty, I wouldn't want to say handily, but definitely was not what was predicted by the polls. So I think that these are all interesting conversations that we always need to have as we go into a election cycle and the polls are thrown around. So let's jump into our first story. This one comes from the website theamericansconservative.com, and the headline reads, "Old liberals are destroying polls." So you may be thinking, whoa, wait, hold on. What do you mean old liberals are destroying polls? Well, for those of you who have been paying attention throughout this election cycle, you may remember the fact that a lot of older people, whenever looking at any of the polls, were actually out there supporting Mr. Biden. And this was sort of a inverse of what people had expected. A lot of them had, or a lot of the commentators had come out and said, whoa, okay, this is interesting. Normally, the older population is a little bit more conservative, and even some rural older voters were actually going for Joe Biden, which seemed to chip away at the stronghold that Donald Trump had built during his 2016 election. And a lot of people put this on the fact that people resonated with Joe Biden. They felt like he was from the same era, but also he has always been able to break into that working class sort of demographic, or at least that was some of the rationale that was provided at the time. Well, I think there's a little bit more to this, and the American Conservative is really trying to get at this when they're talking about what's going on here. They have a few different theories. They have a few different ways that they outline some of the ideas. One of them in particular is that the old white liberal has basically turned into a Karen. That they're out there, they're spreading their beliefs from the very tippy top of the mountaintop. They're loud, they're proud, and they are actually warping or shaping polls because they are willing to make sure their opinion is heard. And this is something that's very, very, I don't want to say controversial, but it's sort of antithetical to what a lot of people believe. A lot of people believe that the older you get, or the common wisdom has been the older you get, the more likely you are to vote conservative, mainly because if the Liberal Party is more willing to accept the progressive side of its caucus and it's willing to transition to some of these new issues and focus on new things, then the older people are going to look to the party that's trying to maintain things as they are. And if they're also being dragged along and the Overton window is constantly shifting, then those people find themselves without a home and they end up sitting right there where the conservatives end up moving to. Now, this is obviously not always 100% true because older people, they don't just sit down and say, you know what, I've been thinking on this for a long time, and I used to vote Democrat all the time, but now they've just moved so far, I'm going to vote conservative. Some people definitely do that, but not everybody. Some people just stick to their priors. They vote for Democrat, or if they're Republicans, they vote Republican no matter what's going on. They don't really have the epiphany. They don't come back from the previous biases that they've had because at the end of the day, they believe their previous choices and the previous buy-in and maybe even the identity that they've constructed around who they vote for and who they align with, it's very strong. It has staying power. And that is the idea of having really strong parties. You can actually lock in some of these people over a long course of time. So what is the American conservative saying is happening here with the liberal or the loud Karen model? Quote, Quinnipiac's last poll before Biden dropped out had him leading Trump among senior citizens by 8 points. The New York Times Siena poll and NPR Marquise poll gave Biden a 4-point lead with baby boomers and the silent generation. Fox News had the 46th president tied with his predecessor. In contrast, the Washington Post and ABC poll gave Trump just a point lead among the crucial demographic. Now, when were we looking at all these things? A little bit ago, when Biden and Trump were both on the ticket. Obviously, things change with Kamala. Now, if you want to go with the current messaging on Kamala, she's a little bit more conservative, she's a little bit more traditional, she would fall maybe in line with that old school liberal kind of thing. Maybe that is something that still appeals to the older generation. If you go with the framing that other people are throwing out there, that she's actually the person who was one of the most left-leaning senators, maybe that scares the older generation. We can't necessarily know yet. We don't necessarily have all of the polls, besides some of the basic ones, but we don't have the post-DNC polls. Even then, polls, as we'll discuss in the second article, can't always be relied upon. And that is also what this article is pointing out. And I want to go to a very specific sentence here in the article. Quote, according to exit polls, Trump beat Clinton by 23 points among senior citizens in North Carolina, but polls leading up to the election had his victory far narrower. Monmouth and the New York Times had his lead at 11 polls. CNN had him up 5, and Elon University tied them. Likewise, in Pennsylvania, Trump beat Clinton by 10 points among seniors in exit polls. Still, serious pollsters undervalued his support among the key demographic group in the last few weeks of the election. CNN had Clinton leading Trump by 4, as did Monmouth. So, there has obviously been a previous sort of discretion, or how should I say, not discretion. There have been discrepancies. There have been mismatches between what the data is saying beforehand and what is actually happening. Is this the silent Trump voter? Is this the person sitting back and saying, you know what? I'm not going to answer your questions. I don't want to sit down. I don't want to say I'm supporting Trump. I don't want to say I'm not supporting Trump. I just don't want to deal with it. Maybe a certain group of people that would vote for him fall into that category. But the American conservative has the inverse. They're saying, actually, the people that want to support the Democrats or the liberal candidates are even louder. And that is what really is making the difference. So let's go into that section of the conversation. Quote, in 2020, Trump performed significantly better against Biden among senior citizens in most of those states, according to exit polls. He won voters 65 years and older by 19 points in North Carolina, 12 points in Georgia, 7 in Nevada and Pennsylvania, 6 in Wisconsin, and a point in Arizona. Biden won seniors in Michigan by 2 points. And then we skip to the final paragraph. Quote, older white liberals' response bias created the illusion that there was a silent Trump voter in the last 2 presidential elections, and they're going to do it again. And then we're going to skip back when they talk about Quinnipiac data. Quinnipiac, quote, has Kamala winning the gray vote by 3 in Pennsylvania. Marquette has her leading by 5 in Wisconsin. Survey USA has Kamala up 10 in North Carolina. And Landmark Communications has Trump up by just 2 in Georgia. So there we go. See what they're doing here? They're actually bringing it forward to some of this more relevant data. And they're drawing these two connections, saying that this really outspoken segment of the population is being weighed too heavily. Whether it is because they reach out to them more, whether it is because they're more willing to be vocal about their opinions, whether it's just because they are louder and the different survey methods are being covered by them. All of these are different possibilities, but at the end of the day, they're saying that there is a response bias that is not properly being accounted for. And you may be sitting there, Alex, like, okay, yeah, we know that. We've known that the polls are a little bit janky for a while. Why is that the case? So I have another article that we're going to go to immediately, which is from the New York Times. The headline reads, "The polls have shifted towards Harris. Is it real or something else?" And this is supposed to elucidate what some of the problems are when going through and making sure that your polling is accurate, making sure that it's up to date, making sure that it accounts for every single piece of data from the last election in order to make those corrections that are supposed to make it more accurate. So let's see what they have to say. Quote, at the center of this question is whether the Times Siena poll have enough voters who supported Donald Trump in 2020. The Trump campaign released a memo arguing that our polls, and this is coming from the writer who works at the New York Times, so that's why he's saying our polls, quote, would have actually showed a Trump lead if we had weighed the results properly. And they go on to say, they kind of skip over some of the letter from Trump, but they go on to say, quote, this isn't an absurd argument. In recent years, many pollsters have embraced recalled votes in exactly the way the Trump campaign describes, as an accurate measure of how people voted in the last election, which can then be used to evaluate the partisan balance of a sample. As an idea, it makes logical sense. So, the Trump team's basically saying that, hey, we have to go to this demographic called the recalled vote. We have to look into these different segments, and we have to really break it down and say how many people actually said that they voted for Donald Trump when maybe they didn't actually. Maybe they just voted for the winning candidate and they're trying to seem like they were on the winning team. Maybe they're actually misremembering when you're going back and doing even further back questions like, oh, who'd you vote for in Gore versus Bush? Most people are probably going to misremember and say, I didn't really like the whole Iraq thing. Maybe they'll say, oh, I voted Gore. Or maybe they're really a staunch Republican and they're going to say, hey, nope, I voted for that, our man, Mr. Bush, the Bush legacy character. Whatever it may be, there is a certain fundamental flaw in the way that we go about polling, which is there's no perfect method. And when I say that, I'm not trying to say, oh, polling, it needs to be thrown out. It obviously provides some sort of indicator as to what's going to happen. Then again, those indicators can be very, very wrong, as we've seen multiple times. But the fundamental flaw is that you don't actually get a large enough sample of the population, unless you're getting every single person in the population. And even then, if you are taking a poll, everybody has to have perfect information, meaning they know exactly what they're going to do. They actually know what they're going to vote for. And a lot of the times that is not the case. And even then, when trying to account for the recall vote, which is something that people are actually focusing on now, that's the Trump critique, that is not even a reliable method when trying to look at these polls. Because guess what? Like I mentioned earlier, some people recall wrong. They actually put their likelihood of voting, or they put down that they voted for somebody else who they didn't actually vote for. And you can tell this by the recall vote saying, oh, well, actually, when we do recall vote surveys, people say that they voted for Biden over Trump and gave basically a Biden a 6% win in 3 major states. Guess what? In those 3 major states, it was actually only a 1.5% win. So that means that basically 4.5% of people that responded to the poll and the average that they're putting out there is wrong. Those people are not actually recalling who they voted for properly. And when you do that, that means that when you base your numbers off the recall vote, like the Trump team is saying you should, guess what? Then you're actually going to over-index on the people who voted for Biden. So how polls work is you look back at your previous methodology, you compare it to the results, you compare it to the exit polls, and you say, okay, how accurate was our methodology? And if you're comparing your methodology to some of these recall vote polls, and you're saying, okay, well, we said that Biden had a 4-point lead, and he ended up having a 6-point lead because you're basing it off of the recall vote numbers, then you're going to over-index the amount of Biden supporters, or if you're using this to project forward into Kamala, which is very, very hard, because guess what? Even if Kamala was on the ticket, she was not the leading candidate. So to use direct Biden versus Trump numbers is not necessarily fair. Then again, you could use it to suss out how much you should index Trump for, because guess what? If there's a state where the recall poll has him at -4, but in reality he was actually only -1, he only lost by 1 percentage point basically, then you can say, okay, hey, we actually need to we need to mess with the numbers a little bit in order to make our methodology a little bit more accurate by like 3 points. And as a person who does not know all of the mechanics of polls, because guess what? There's an entire industry. There's a whole bunch of consultants out there that have a whole bunch of different methodologies of how they actually crunch these numbers and how they adjust for those Trump voters, whether it be actually changing the weighting and the average of it, or just possibly trying to go out and find a different sample size, or trying to find a similar sample size but changing one or two variables. All these are different possibilities, but there are many ways to try to account for this 3%. But if you're doing it off of a recall vote poll, trying to adjust your methodology that way, then guess what? You're more than likely going to do it wrong, because the recall vote poll is not accurate, as we just discussed. They said in the recall vote poll in 3 major states, oh, yeah, actually Biden would have won by 6% if this was true. He didn't win by 6%. So people are not actually telling the truth. And I'm not saying they're sitting there lying. They could just misremember. Or they're sitting there and they're thinking about it like, I don't want to make it sound like I voted for the wrong guy. I don't want to make it sound like I voted for the losing side. And it's not like a white-faced lie. It is just something where it's a little bit of human nature, and they're trying to go along with the winning group. So what else is there to say about this? Quote, there are at least 3 factors at play. A surprising number of people don't seem, and this is talking about the issue with recall vote as a method of trying to analyze what happened in the previous election. There are at least 3 factors at play. 1, quote, a surprising number of people don't seem to remember how they voted. People seem likelier to remember voting for the winner, Biden in 2020, Bush in 2000, and they seem likelier to report voting when they did not. Because that's also a thing. If you're getting called about it and 66% of the population voted, you don't want to seem like you're a person that wasn't civically engaged. You don't want to say, oh, I couldn't make it out of work to do it, or I couldn't go before work to do it. So you want to say that you voted, and you then, when you do it, you say, oh, well, it's the person that won. Obviously, why wouldn't I vote for that guy? So those are all 3 things that actually skew the numbers again, that they change the outcome in these different polls and they warp reality a little bit at the end of the day. But there's a little bit of something to them, and the author doesn't want to completely throw them out the door. Quote, despite this history, more pollsters have been using recall votes in recent years. For some pollsters with low-quality samples, recall vote is a blunt instrument that can hammer even the worst of polls into the ballpark. Indeed, if you take the last year of time span of poll respondents from Manhattan, which Biden won by 74 points, you can produce an entirely plausible Trump plus 3 result for a national poll by weighting it to the 2020 result nationwide. So that's basically saying this is actually popular for a lot of people because you can really get the result that you want. And I'm not saying they're purposely manipulating it, but they're saying, well, with this eventuality, and we're trying to account for these different segment of Biden voters that were out there, or the people that didn't want to vote for Donald Trump, if you weight it too heavily, you can get a result like this, which shows a extremely big win for Mr. Trump. Quote, even serious pollsters have used recalled vote in recent years. Some believe that the measure has become more accurate during a polarized era, which certainly seems plausible. It's also possible that it's more accurate for some new survey methodologies like panels, which attract highly engaged voters, or even just online polls in general. So that's very interesting to me, because those are actually 2 very different things. The highly engaged voters are probably already going to have their opinions locked in. They're going to have very strong policy proposals or wants from their candidate, and they're going to have their ideology set for the most part. That's what happens when you're very engaged. You have your strong opinions, and I would honestly say if you have very strong opinions, you're more likely to be engaged. If you don't know what you really care about in the political sphere, you're probably not going to be as engaged. I run into it all the time. People are like, I don't know, I don't care, and they just don't worry about it. Versus other people who have personal experience with certain issues, they have very specific moral qualms with either side's position on certain issues. They are more likely to be vocal, they're more likely to participate, and they would be accounted for in these panels, which would be more affected by partisan, I don't want to say hackery, but partisan leanings. And then the inverse is the online polls, because on the online polls, you're probably getting a lot of people that are just clicking through. You're probably getting a lot of people who are casually involved. You're probably getting people who are like, oh, possibly get a $25 Amazon gift card out of this? Sure. So you're getting a little bit more of the casuals. So then you also have to try to account for that. Now, the fact that this method of using the recalled vote in order to stem both of those problems could actually work is interesting to me. And I think that in the future, I want to do a little bit deeper dive on both of those how the recalled vote applies to both of those. But the author goes on to talk about some of the advantages, disadvantages. We've already talked about some of the disadvantages. We've talked about some advantages, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper here as we go into the bottom part of the article. Quote, "It's especially striking that recalled vote wouldn't have helped Time Siena polls in 2020, a year when other surveys, along with virtually all other surveys, fairly significantly underestimated support for Mr. Trump. In fact, the Time Siena poll would have underestimated Trump by even more if they had been weighted by recall votes to match the actual results of the 2016 presidential election. That's because the Time Siena polls had too many Trump 16 voters, a surprising finding, but one consistent with the long history of people who voted for the losing candidate, but who often later say they supported someone else." And this is where you get into problems. Because if you have a over-indexed amount of one person, in we can say this for the most part because Trump is a consistent figure at this point. If you have an over-index or an under-index, it can drastically reframe or shift the amount of people that you're saying will be voting for him if you put some of these weighted results into it. And you may be thinking, oh, wait, hold on, Alex, how does that work? If they under-indexed him in 2016, so basically they're saying in the Time Siena poll, we had underestimated him. And then you have another poll that comes out and says that he got even more votes than he actually got, then guess what? You're going to go in there and say, okay, we got to tinker with some things here. We got to bring up some of the value, but also we're going to apply this post-voting metric, this remembered or recalled voting metric, and it shows that there is an even larger gap there, so we actually have to account for that for the amount of people that said they voted for him versus the actual ones that went out and voted for him. And then you're going to have it skewed a little bit negative again. You're going to start underestimating him again because those numbers that you're accounting for are not accurate because you're trying to bake in those extra numbers of people who said they voted for him when they really didn't. And that is not going to go well because if you bake those numbers in and they didn't actually vote for him and they don't do it again, if they didn't actually vote for him this first time, they can't do it again. But if they didn't actually vote for him that first time and they said they did, and you're trying to account for that and you're trying to take negative points off, like, okay, hey, here are the baked in voters for him, and they go out and they do vote for him, then it's going to over-index. But also, if they still don't go out and vote for him, then it's still over-indexed. It's one of those things where polls are so extremely finicky. And there are methodologies that have been solid. I mean, the Iowa polls, the Iowa primary polls have been considered gold standard for a long time. Siena and New York Times also have been considered gold standard. And yet, they're wrong. So I'm not trying to say that, hey, you can't trust all polls, but what I'm getting at is it is a constant science because there are new polling methods, whether it be the panels that become more popular, whether it be online, whether it be phone banking, whether it be in-person surveys. All of these are different methods, all have been tried differently, and you obviously have to weigh the results differently. Who's going to respond to online stuff? Maybe some younger people, less older people. Who's going to respond to the phone banking people? Older people. All these have different methodologies, and sometimes you can actually have crossbreeding methodologies for weighting them properly, but we're constantly learning. We are always finding new methods. So you have to take all of them with a grain of salt because even this gentleman who does believe in the power of polling, he's sitting there saying, well, it's kind of right. Like, if we do it this way, it kind of works, but also here are all the flaws. And I didn't want to bring you into this episode to give you a conclusive answer to whether polling works or not, because I don't think there is a conclusive answer. I think that it can be right on the money, it can be off the money. You never take polls too seriously. That's what people do too often. They're like, oh, the polls say that it's up. Oh, it's going to be a red wave. Oh, the people are going to be voting for this ballot amendment or this ballot measure on abortion. Oh, the polls say XYZ, we got it locked. Polls cause complacency in the political sphere. Never, ever, ever trust them over what you're hearing on the ground. I have done this before when I volunteered for a campaign. The polls said one thing, and I was out on the ground, and I was like, I'm not feeling it. I'm not feeling this love that you guys are showing. I'm going to be honest with you. And it ended up being the case that the polls were not necessarily super wrong. They were just wrong, and it did not end well, and people were very, very frustrated with that at the end of the day. And all I had to do was sit back, and I didn't say it to anybody there because, one, I hadn't spoken out during the time that I was there, so it doesn't really matter if I say, oh, well, after the fact I knew. But I sat there with myself. I was like, okay, yeah, I probably should have spoken up because you could feel this coming when you were on the ground. And that is what is always going to be the big determiner. When you're on the ground, can you feel the passion? Can you feel the love? Can you feel the joy? And if you can feel the joy in the populace that is going out and voting and saying they're voting for somebody, then you can actually gain a realistic understanding of what is possibly going to happen. But polls are not always that. No matter how well they are weighted, no matter how accurate they are in one cycle, you never know about the next, especially in this time when things are getting crazier and crazier and the demographics are not stable. They haven't ever really been stable, but nowadays they're shifting so much that it's really hard. But there's another example of how polls can be misused, and not just by political campaigns trying to say that they're going to win or to cause complacency. It actually is one that's trying to shift public opinion on a ballot measure. The headline comes from Tech Industry Uses Push Poll to Stop California AI Bill. Comes from prospect.org. So let's get into not necessarily the nitty-gritty details, but let's jump in and hop into something that I think is really important. The AI issue, there's actually a ballot amendment that is trying to restrict some of the access and abilities of AI companies. And the AI companies, they got a really favorable polling firm, or at least a polling firm that they were paying, and they got some very operable results. And the question was actually really biased. So I'll tell you what some of the results. I'll tell you what the amendment or the ballot measure is. I'll tell you what, at the end of the day, they were trying to restrict, and then we're going to talk about the question on the poll. Quote, the California Assembly just passed SB 1047, a first-of-a-kind AI safety bill. The legislation would require producers of the next-generation artificial intelligence models to create safety plans designed to prevent mass damage or casualty events. It's a first step to regulating AI in the state with more activity in this space than anywhere else. Supporters describe the bill as common sense, light touch regulation. The industry that seeks to profit handsomely off these models fiercely disagrees and has pulled out all the stops to kill it. Okay, so now you have a little bit of the background. You understand what's going on here. So what were the results when they actually put this poll out there? And I want to read the poll question, but I want to also read the results first, and then you can see what some of the results actually were. Quote, AIPI conducted 2 previous statewide surveys of SB 1047, finding support from 59% of respondents in July to 65% in early August. And they also, in this last one, found a 70% support for the bill. So this is the realistic polling. This is the one that is not asking the biased question. So you can see what's going on here. What happens when the biased question is asked? And so when the question was asked, when the polling was done, and it was the biased question, which I will read you after this, the answers that people gave were 28% in support, 46 opposed, 26 were neutral. That's a huge swing. Support from around 30% to 65%, or even at its top number, 77%. That is an extremely biased poll. So what was the language of the poll? Here's how they phrase it. Quote, lawmakers in Sacramento have proposed a new state law, SB 1047, that would create a new California state regulatory agency to determine how AI models can be developed. This new law would require small startup companies to potentially pay tens of millions of dollars in fines if they don't implement orders from the state bureaucrats. Some say burdensome regulations such as SB 1047 would potentially lead companies to move out of the state or out of the country, taking investment in jobs away from California. Given everything you just read, do you support or oppose a proposal like SB 1047? And the reason that I am always skeptical of polls when I just hear the numbers is what were the questions. And when you start telling me what the questions were, I'm a little bit more open to hearing it out, having a conversation. But if the question is something like that, you can see why the answers are so drastic. If you put all of the terrible things that Trump said in front of a poll question and you say, are you more likely to support this man? Probably not going to get a better answer. If you put all of the whack nut things that Kamala Harris has said in front of her polls, then probably going to get different answers. So how you frame things is extremely important. And it also shows how volatile people are when responding to these polls, and how even a small change, even though that last example was a huge change, but in general, how even a small change can affect the outcome of the polls. So always be skeptical. Always be understanding where the polls are coming from. If it's gas legislation and it's coming from a polling firm backed by the gas agencies, then maybe you should be a little skeptical. But hey, let's stop with that skepticism. Let's end with a little bit of happiness. We're jumping to our daily delight from Stringer's Hub. The headline reads, China ragdoll cat hits and run. And this is a cute 11-second video where there's two cats fighting. One is trying to, pounce up on the other, and the one just kind of fights back like, get off me. And everything just goes back to complete normal. It's honestly amazing just the interactions that cats have with one another, how they can be bothered 1 second, they're just back to like, oh, yeah, everything's cool, no big. I honestly love some of the indifference from cats, even though I really dread it as a potential cat owner. If I was one, I would be very afraid of their indifference, but sometimes it is funny. So if you want to see this cute video, or you want to read any of today's articles, all of them will be in the link in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. Like I said, it's all in the description below that like and subscribe button. Go on down there, see it, leave a comment based on whether or not you trust polls, especially after listening to the entire episode. If you've made it all the way through, thank you. And with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.